Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the Current Consulting Group and sponsored by SureHire. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and I will be facilitating today's presentation titled What Employers Should Know About DOT's New Oral Fluid Testing Regulations. Today's presentation qualifies for one continuing education credit from SHRM, HRCI, and CCDAP for those who attend the presentation in its entirety. You will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for that credit. Shortly, we'll be sharing with you a short video from today's sponsor, SureHire. The audio for the video is available through your computer speakers only, so if you have dialed in for today's presentation, you will not hear the audio. However, you will be able to hear it if you watch the recorded version of today's presentation available later in the week. And with that, we're excited to hear from today's webinar sponsor, SureHire. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Erin Baird, Director of Client Relations.
Thanks, Greta. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Baird, Director of Client Relations at SureHire. We're excited to be sponsoring this presentation focused on what employers should know about DOT's new oral fluid testing regulations. With the final regulations for oral fluid testing now in place, it's essential for employers to have a comprehensive understanding of DOT's regulations to make informed decisions on implementing an oral fluid testing program. A little bit of a background on SureHire. We began our journey in 2005 as a small physiotherapy team, assessing and treating clients who had been injured on the job site. Working with those injured employees and their respective employers really galvanized our passion for workplace injury prevention, health promotion, and rehabilitation. Today, we have grown to become a full spectrum occupational testing and pre-employment screening company, servicing clients in the United States and Canada. Our services include drug and alcohol, fit for duty, mask fit, audiometric testing, background screening, online safety training, and more. And we'd like to show you a little bit more about our company with this brief video.
SureHire has been a leading provider of occupational testing since 2005. SureHire started because there was a clear demand for a provider that could offer industry-specific testing. It's been incredible to see how much we've been able to support safe and productive workforces and to see our people and technologies grow.
From the moment a participant arrives for their appointment, they're met by knowledgeable, dedicated staff that guide them through the testing process. Our paperless intake systems make the check-in process simple, and our technology ensures data is protected and secure every step of the way. What makes us different than other providers is we actually work with our clients to ensure they get the services they need when and where they need them. From drug and alcohol testing to audiometric and fitness to work testing to online education and training and even on-site mobile testing.
The work we do doesn't just get people a job. It helps hard-working individuals arrive home safe and sound every day. It helps build stronger, healthier, and more productive workforces and communities. From construction to transportation, manufacturing to mining, forestry and agriculture to security and even corporate business.
When you work with SureHire, you're connected. You work with individuals driven by excellence who work hard to help your business grow.
When you work with SureHire, you work with us.
At SureHire, like the video said, our core purpose is to provide the foundations for safe, healthy, and productive workforces and communities. This is why today's webinar topic, focusing on the recent developments in oral fluid drug testing, is so important to us at SureHire. And now it's time to hear from Bill Current and Brian Feely on what employers should know about DOT's new oral fluid drug testing regulations.
Well, thank you, Erin. I love watching that. Excuse me. I love watching that video because it's just so succinct, and it just in a very concise way gives a real clear idea of what SureHire does. And having been in the drug testing industry here in the United States for 34 years, and of course SureHire is based in Canada, but they have operations from brick and mortar locations here in the United States. What they offer is unique, and so I really appreciate that we're doing this webinar together and that they're bringing sort of this full comprehensive suite of services to employers, because it's so important, especially going forward now that we're in this age of legal marijuana. As I've often told Aaron in conversations we've had, the United States is probably 10 years behind Canada on the marijuana issue, but we're heading in that direction, and they know how to deal with those things because they've been doing it for a lot longer than most US-based providers. So as we go forward in sort of the future of drug-free workplace programs, I think a lot of emphasis will be on fitness for duty, and regardless of the reason why somebody may be impaired. Drug testing will never go away. I believe it's here to stay. And we're going to talk about oral fluid testing in particular because a lot of huge developments there. But I think it's going to be sort of a combination of different types of screening services that help employers maintain a safe and productive workforce, which includes drug testing, among other things. And so I'm also excited today to be co-presenting with our Vice President here at the Current Consulting Group, Brian Feely, and he'll be coming on in just a few slides to sort of do the heavy lifting through today's webinar. As you can see from his bio there, he spent a lot of years in this industry, 26 years at OraSure Technologies, which is the #1 recognized brand in oral fluid testing. So he knows that stuff very well. We're going to talk about the DOT regulations for oral fluid testing and what they mean for you and how to go about using them. This is the agenda that we're going to follow. So we'll take you through the new DOT regulations just briefly. I'm sure everybody's heard a lot about them, but we'll entertain any questions that you have, no matter how specific or detailed you'd like to be in the question that you asked. And then we'll talk about when the new regulations go into effect and how you can apply them. We're going to talk about what the regulations permit and do not permit. And then we'll get into some very specific things about what they mean for a non-DOT drug testing program. And then we'll wrap it up with a little bit of talk about return on investment from oral fluid testing. So as we launch into that, Brian and I would love to invite you to ask any questions that you might have today. And as Greta said, if we run out of time at the end, we'll provide a written response to your questions. So feel free to ask any questions having to do with drug testing, oral fluid testing, SureHire services, etc., and we will answer it today if possible, or we will send a written response that everybody can see. So let's start with the introduction. I'll take this first part. So what is oral fluid testing, right? It seems like on the surface, that's a pretty easy question to answer, and you can see the information over to the right. Brian could actually go into a lot of scientific and technical detail to this question. But in the world of drug testing from an employer's perspective, it's testing individuals with an oral fluid sample as opposed to a typical sort of traditional urine testing program. For more than 30 years now, urine testing, especially through a laboratory, has sort of been the king of the hill. And we've seen the rise of alternative testing methods like oral fluid and like hair testing that are starting to have a big impact on market share, to put it in those terms. And I'm going to share some statistics coming up here in a second on how the industry has evolved in this regard. But for many, many years, the drug testing industry was sort of reluctant to open the door to oral fluid testing and hair testing, even to point of collection testing versus lab-based testing. And we've seen a lot of movement, a lot more flexibility within the industry. And the primary reason for that is because the market is demanding that. So again, as we go through this, if you do have technical questions, feel free to do that. But I do want to point out the third bullet. It looks at substances that are currently in the body. It's detecting the parent drug. Let's say somebody smoked a joint during their lunch break, or a couple of joints, let's say, and they come back in and there's reasonable suspicion to suspect that the individual may be under the influence or impaired, or they're just not acting right, or there's sort of outward manifestations. There's a smell perhaps coming off of them. So in an oral fluid sample, you'll be able to detect the parent drug, the drug itself, which becomes detectable in oral fluid within minutes after the individual has smoked the joints. Whereas with other drug testing methods, especially urine testing, which is of course a valid and well accepted testing method, but in a urine sample, we're looking at a metabolite, or we're detecting a metabolite of THC, and that takes some hours before it becomes detectable in a urine sample. So whereas with oral fluid, we have the capability of detecting drug use within minutes after somebody smokes the joint, with urine, it's going to take 6-7 hours thereabouts before that drug becomes detectable in the urine sample. And so if there's some suspicion of somebody having marijuana in their system after this lunch break, as I described, or maybe an accident occurred and you're looking for a drug testing method that has the capacity to show recent drug use, as well as beyond that first 15 minutes, then oral fluid testing is a good possibility for you. And that's why a lot of companies are sort of pushing the drug testing industry toward oral fluid testing, other things as well. I mean, part of what we're going to talk about at length today is the DOT regulations, and Brian will cover most of that. But that's motivating drug testing providers to go in this direction. It's sort of a market-driven trend that I think is going to continue for some time to come. And then look at those last two bullets: collected using a device placed in the mouth. Okay, very easy to do. You don't have to turn off the hot water in a restroom or put blue dye in the toilet water. It's very easy, simple to do. Sometimes collectors in an oral fluid test are sometimes referred to as observers, because it's really sort of a donor-driven collection process. And if you're using a point of collection test, it's very easy to be able to do that with oral fluid versus the process that you have to go to secure a restroom at the facility with urine. It makes it possible actually for collections to take place at the work site in, say, very remote locations, like where construction companies and oil and gas companies typically have their workers. It makes it very easy to do it that way with oral fluid, as opposed to sort of the traditional route of sending somebody to an off-site collection site. So collections can take place anytime, anywhere. You've got a 24-hour work shift, maybe a graveyard shift, as I mentioned, remote locations, things of that nature. It's really good in, I think we're going to see a lot more of this. If you go down to the second to last bullet, it makes same-day hiring decisions possible. I think we'll see that in industries where there's a lot of turnover, where there are a lot of sort of job fairs or mass hiring activities and events, where they want to be able to make an offer to an individual right on site where the interview and the vetting is taking place. And that's very possible with oral fluid and with point of collection testing with oral fluid. And now go back up a little bit to the third bullet. Because the donor and the collector/observer are right next to each other throughout the entire collection process, it's really almost impossible for somebody to cheat on an oral fluid drug test. The adulteration becomes nearly impossible. I'm not saying that there aren't some ingenious people out there who could find a way around it, but if you're following the instructions that typically come with an oral fluid collection device, and you're waiting some minutes before the individual actually puts the swab in their mouth and starts to provide the oral fluid sample, and then the collector and the donor are right in front of each other the whole time, it's 100% observed, then it's just not going to be possible to cheat on that. And that's really going to do away with one of the big bugaboos when it comes to urine testing. Again, not a criticism, but one of the challenges we've had over the last 3 decades is that cheating on a urine test has become a cottage industry. If you want to go onto the website and do a Google search, for example, on how to beat a drug test, or even how to cheat on a drug test, or how to pass a drug test, you'll find hundreds and thousands of websites that are offering advice, selling products that will walk you through the whole process. And it's kind of interesting, in preparation for a webinar a few weeks ago, I wanted to see what's the latest advice out there on how to beat an oral fluid test, because now we've got these DOT regulations and we're going to see a lot more companies turning to oral fluid testing. So, what's the latest advice on how to beat it? And the one I liked the best was, if you're going to participate in an oral fluid test, the best advice is to stop using drugs for at least 3 or 4 days. Now, the window of detection may not be 3 or 4 days, but the point is that they're telling people, abstain from using drugs, because if you don't, you're probably going to test positive. with an oral fluid. Now, a lot of factors go into that, of course. And I like the next bullet, legally defensible. That's really now a very strong attribute of oral fluid testing, especially lab-based oral fluid testing or instant oral fluid testing using an FDA-cleared device, now that we have these DOT regulations out. I'm going to talk at the very end of today's presentation about what the DOT regulations mean for your non-DOT testing program. But the legal defensibility is stronger now than ever when it comes to oral fluid testing. It's always been there for a urine testing program that follows the 49 CFR Part 40 guidelines from SAMHSA. And now that you've got oral fluid, lab-based oral fluid testing anyways, components built into Part 40, the legal defensibility of oral fluid testing is really right on par with urine testing. And as I already talked about, the recent use detection covering the potential impairment window. So, you know, here in the United States, there's a big issue when it comes to marijuana and marijuana impairment and the detection of being able to create some correlation between a positive drug test result and when the person used the drugs, how recently they used it. What's interesting there is that there are states that require employers to, in addition to a positive test result for marijuana, show some other evidence to go along with that. And if you're using a drug test that has the capacity to show recent use, like oral fluid, in combination with other aberrant behavior that you've documented, somebody who's been chronically late over the last few weeks or months, somebody whose work performance is now suffering, et cetera, and you've documented that, all of those things combined with the positive drug test result from a recent use detection testing method create a stronger argument for that employer to take whatever adverse employment action is covered in their policy. And so those are sort of the advantages. Some consideration is that well, there are 47 states that clearly allow lab-based oral fluid testing. There are still 3 states, Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii, that will put in the no category when it comes to state laws. But I think Maine and Vermont will I think they're going to get in line very quickly now that there are DOT regulations out there, which are based on the 2019 SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration regulations on lab-based oral fluid testing. So I think we'll see probably those 2 fall. What's interesting about Hawaii is that Hawaii has always allowed point of collection oral fluid testing, but they have prohibited lab-based oral fluid testing. So maybe some movement there as well, but certainly I think we'll see Maine and Vermont get on board with that. And some of the other things that you see there, I want to go to the last bullet though there on the right, shorter window of detection. There are some people, some employers that want a longer window of detection. With oral fluid testing, you're looking at, you know, a window that depends a lot on the drugs and it depends on a lot of other factors, but let's say it's somewhere between 24 and 48 hours for most drugs. And with urine, you're looking at 2 to 3, maybe 4 days of a window of detection. Of course, people are always saying that with urine, you're going to get positives for 3 or 4 weeks after somebody smokes a joint. That's true that the drug is detectable in somebody's system, but at the cutoff levels that we typically use, vis-a-vis things like 49 CFR Part 40, which many states sort of defer to when it comes to the technical aspects of drug testing, somebody's not going to test positive if the last time they used marijuana was 3 or 4 weeks ago. It may still be in their system. It may even still be detectable, but they're not going to, they're probably not going to test positive. I mean, that would be very uncommon. Now, when the current consulting group conducted its annual survey of the drug testing industry, which we've been doing now for 25 years, it was a survey co-sponsored by SureHire. This was the 2022 industry survey. We saw a surge in the percentage of drug testing providers who say they now offer oral fluid testing, from 36% in 2019 to nearly 86% in 2022. Of course, what happened between 2019 and 2022? Well, we had the pandemic, and that really pushed a lot of companies to look for some alternate method of doing the drug testing that didn't involve sending people to Occ Health centers, because in many cases, those facilities that they had depended on for urine collections were no longer offering urine collection services because they were dealing with, justifiably, a lot of sick people who were coming in to get tested or vaccinated for COVID. So as an alternative, many companies during that period turned to oral fluid testing, and you saw a lot of providers going in that direction as well, which is a very interesting development because we're not seeing that high percentage come down now that the pandemic has been over for a year. We're seeing that percentage stay up there, and part of that is because I think a lot of employers have decided this is a viable alternative that I'm interested in continuing with. And when we asked providers in this year's drug testing survey what drug testing method will be most used in the future, 46% said urine and 46% said oral fluid. Out of over 500 people who participated in the survey, urine and oral fluid tied exactly at 46%. If we had asked that question, say 15 or 20 years ago in our 25-year history of doing the survey, which we didn't used to ask the question like that or in this way, so we can't compare data, but I would venture to say that urine would have dominated at 90 to 95% maybe, and oral fluid testing would have been somewhere below 10%, depending on the urine breakdown. My point here is that the industry has come a long way because employers are demanding flexible, alternative, fast ways to do drug testing that work for them under the very challenging circumstances that they now find themselves in. So with that, let me turn the virtual microphone over to my partner, Brian Feely, who will take us through the next few sections.
All right, thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar, and SureHire for sponsoring it. They really are experts in occupational health testing, and if you don't use them today, they're someone you should definitely check out. So just a quick story, I was at OraSure, as Bill mentioned, for 26 years, and about 20 years ago, it was when SAMHSA and a group called DTAB started to collect data on oral fluid. And it was really in the early stages of oral fluid being used, and that was laboratory-based oral fluid testing only back then. And through the years, it's taken a lot of data and a lot of convincing, I think, and a lot of practical support from the field and from the market to drive things forward. We had continued to work on the guidelines and help any way we could with information and data. And here we are today, 20 years later, where the SAMHSA regs are out, DOT has their rules in place, and now it's just a function of seeing these labs get certified and get ready, which I'll be talking about a little bit more. But it's a great time for the industry because it gives another valid sample type to be used for workplace testing and for other areas of drug testing as well. It sort of further validates oral fluid as a matrix that is approved and has all the right attributes that you want to see in a sample type for drug testing. So kind of start with some general things. We'll drill down a little bit further into some of these requirements, but essentially the general overview is the DOT has the rule in place now that basically allows for laboratory-based oral fluid testing to be used on DOT regulated employees. There is a period right now, we'll call it an implementation period, where you can't officially start using oral fluid because we have to have and see 2 labs that get certified by the Department of HHS. And so that's in the works right now. I think it's taken some time for, if you looked at it pre-COVID, there was a lot of momentum and labs were kind of gearing up to get certified. But 2 things happened, COVID, and that took a lot of wind out of, I think, the sales and some issues related to getting clinical samples and moving things forward. But I think also what was happening during that time was DOT was also giving signals that they were going to come out with their guidance. And I think that the industry paused a bit to see what were those going to look like. Were they going to be any different than SAMHSA? Were there going to be some differences in devices, which we had suspected there would be? And so, lo and behold, here we are where there are now, I think there's forward movement with labs to get certified. I did see a question in the chat come in, is there anybody that is currently certified? The answer to that is no. But things are moving quicker now, and I think now that the rules are in place, everybody knows what they need to do in terms of requirements and device design, et cetera, you're going to see those labs start to get certified here in the coming, I won't say this year because that may be a little aggressive, but certainly in the coming within the next half year to year, that will happen. So the rule includes device requirements. That means the collection device itself, collector requirements in terms of what they have to do, what you have to do to be a collector, and how you have to perform the collections. Some requirements around the site itself and the collection process. There are cutoff levels. The DOT is no different than SAMHSA in this regard. So SAMHSA or DOT follows SAMHSA on most of the scientific guidance. So those cutoffs are the same, and I'll show them in a few minutes. There's some updates in the DOT rules for MROs and SAPs and laboratories in terms of procedures. There was also some technical updates to urine testing in those in the latest guidelines. So that's kind of a general overview. Continuing with a little more general stuff. So laboratory-based oral fluid testing can be used across the board. There were no restrictions in terms of what type of testing, can it be used for pre-employment and not for post-accident or whatever. No, it really can be used in all cases. And it's really something that is approved for all the DOT modalities. The only exception is with FRA, the Federal Rail Post-Accident Toxicology Testing Program. And I wasn't really sure why that was the case, but reached out to Patrice Kelleny. If you don't know Patrice, she's one of the longest, I think is the longest serving director at ODAPSI under DOT, and she now works with NDASA as a senior policy advisor as well. So she's the person I go to when I have any questions about this sort of stuff. She knows everything. And it turns out the FRA, kind of a trivia question, the FRA's post-accident program doesn't fall under DOT. It's actually was established prior to the DOT rules and is funded by Congress, and it sort of sits outside of that on its own. All the other FRA testing reasons for testing are regulated, but not post-accident. So it was kind of interesting to hear that, and I kind of understand a little bit more now why that is the case. At any rate, the POC oral fluid tests are not permitted and it's not just oral fluid, it's any POC, rapid urine or oral fluid are not permitted under the program. Doesn't necessarily mean anything negative about those types of tests, but it's more the way they would be used and interpreted, and privacy issues and other things. So rapid tests aren't allowed under the program. Collections can be done in-house. Bill may have mentioned, I think, that because the collections are all directly observed and they're really not so much onerous on like urine collections can be with bathrooms and monitoring this and all that sort of thing. It can be done pretty easily in-house, or it can be done at a collection site. For years now, we've seen and have helped customers with both in-house collections and collections taking place at collection sites. They can't be performed virtually yet, so that may come down the road, but there's a lot of issues that people, I think are sorting through with regard to remote collections that are under video observation, telehealth, if you will. Some areas of testing individuals that want to undergo the test because of the benefit to them are a little bit easier to do via video than someone who's really not necessarily looking to cooperate with their urine or oral fluid drug screen. And so that's not allowed. Employers should definitely start to think about where would they use oral fluid versus urine, and there's some clear differentiators we'll talk a little bit more about. One thing that is in the DOT rules is there's a mandatory use of oral fluid for transgender and binary individuals that are going to undergo a direct observed collection. So that is one area where oral fluid must be used. Okay, so there, let me go back one second. The reasons DOT added oral fluid to the guidelines are some of the things that Bill talked about in his one slide on oral fluid lab-based testing. The versatility in detection, and that has to do with that recent use piece where you can pick up things very, very recently after someone has used a drug is really important. things like the transgender binary individuals, other difficult situations to collect. People sometimes can't pee, physiologically. And so it reduces the burdens on those types of individuals. There are some cost benefits depending upon where you do oral fluid, how you do the collection and the collection process. There's an enhanced flexibility because of the fact that they can be done anytime, anywhere. It takes away some of the burdens or situations where remote collections or third shifts or weekend collections are difficult to do with urine. That it provides that flexibility. It also deals with invalid tests, as Bill mentioned. It's really hard to cheat a oral fluid test. You can't dilute the sample. You can drink all the water you want the night before, the day of your test. You can't dilute your blood, and that's really what oral fluid is, a filtrate of your blood. So it really eliminates those invalid tests. And there's some real time savings that can be realized from using oral fluids. So when do the guidelines go into effect, and how can an employer apply them? Well, the oral fluid guidelines, the DOT guidelines, really went into effect June 1st of this year. But as I mentioned, there are, no one can actually start doing it yet until at least 2 labs are certified. And the reason for that is you want your primary lab to get certified using a particular collection device or devices, and you want there to also be a backup laboratory in case a sample has to undergo challenge testing or they have to send it out for further testing at another lab. You need at least 2 of them to be certified. So, you can't start as of today, but you can certainly do it if you're non-regulated. But this is a good time for employers and providers to familiarize themselves with the guidelines, what they say, what they're going to need to do to get ready for it, to look at their policies, and things move pretty quick. So it won't be too long before there will be certified labs and devices that are approved, and then there'll be a rush to get to it. So collectors, of course, cannot start and get qualified until those devices and those labs are certified. So there's a need for a device that meets the guidelines. I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And then there's the labs being certified, and then collectors can undergo the official training program for doing oral fluid collections, and that should move pretty quick once the devices are approved or devices approved and the labs are certified. So this just reviews a little bit of the timeline. If you were following things in the past, the SAMHSA implementation guideline was effective January 1st, and I think I already mentioned due to COVID there was a delay there. A lot of things did happen during that time period, and behind the scenes, if you're in the business or have been in the business for a while, you probably know about things like proficiency sample testing and certification programs and things that the labs have to do to get ready for their testing. So it's not like nothing has been going on. I think it's now just going to be on a more accelerated path. Okay, so some general things about the oral fluid device. And under the DOT program, and this is the difference between SAMHSA, and I'll cover SAMHSA first. So under their guidelines, they allow for what you could refer to as a single-use collection device. And so that collection device could be a single device placed on the right side of the mouth and another single device placed on the left side of the mouth. So you could do 2 collections at the same time, or you could do them serially, where you collect right now and do a collection of 1 sample, and then 5 minutes later you do the second sample. And so that isn't exactly allowed for the DOT program based on the Omnibus Act and the way the rules are written. It really requires the collection of a single sample that can be divided into 2 in the presence of the donor. And so that's what the difference between the device that would be used for HHS federal testing versus DOT. And so what you're likely going to see is, I think very few people will develop a device strictly just for federal employees. You'll have the market really evolving now to the use to a device that will allow for DOT and therefore also allow for SAMHSA federal testing. The one other difference is that within the DOT rules, they specify that the expiration date on the vial, which is part of the collection kit, has to be clearly visible and cannot be covered by the tamper evident seal. And so there's an onus on the collector to make sure that they observe that expiration date, and it's to be written on the chain of custody form. So the you know, lot number and expiration date is really something that's recorded right on the chain of custody form where the collection is taking place. And if they forget to do that, the sample gets sent in, then the lab really has to be able to look at that expiration date. And that's the reason for that little nuance. Okay, so there are very few differences in terms of the testing modes, what you can use oral fluid for in SAMHSA versus DOT. As I mentioned, I think they are mandated, oral fluid is mandated under certain circumstances, which is that transgender binary use. And regardless of basically the similarities or differences between SAMHSA and DOT, really, you know, there's the federal program and there's the DOT program, and they have to follow those guidelines. Okay, so how can regulated employers start applying the new DOT regs? Well, as I may have mentioned, reviewing policies, making sure that oral fluids is included in the policy, making sure if you're going to include things specific about where you're going to use it or how you're going to use it, that they're updated in your plan. It's a good time to figure out, you know, what would you do if a collector in a collection situation where you can't get a urine sample, then make sure it clearly specifies the use of oral fluid. If you can't get an oral fluids sample, you know, that it specifies that urine sample is the backup. And this is part of the DER's responsibility, and I think that's coming up in a slide. You know, it's even more important now that they be available 24/7 and with a phone number where they can be reached, because there could be situations in the field where an employee is to be tested and one sample can't be collected for one reason or another. That falls back to the employer and that DER to make that choice. Okay, what do the new regs not permit? Well, basically, and how a little bit more specificity on the device itself. What do they permit, and how does the device have to be designed? So the oral fluid collection device can be a device that collects a neat sample, which is, you know, what we would call whole saliva or undiluted saliva. And as long as that sample is collected and can be subdivided in the presence of the donor into an A and a B sample, 2 samples, then it qualifies. That could also be a pad based system, as you may be aware of in the market. There's Intercept and Quantasol and a few others that have pads. That system can consist of 2 pads that are back to back or side by side, as long as they're joined in some way that it sort of represents a uniform sample, and therefore has to also be collected from the same region of the mouth. So you can't have a collection device in the right side and one on the left side. That doesn't constitute the same region of the mouth. The device has to have an indicator on it that demonstrates that you've collected sufficient volume. 1 ml is the volume that you know, per sample that has typically been used as the target for these devices. So 2 ml total would have to be collected, you know, 1 ml in sample A and 1 ml in sample B. The vial has to be sufficiently transparent to allow you to see that the sample has been, you know, it's put in there and there's no odd colors or nothing else was in the vial itself. Of course, you would want a tamper evident type packaging, and you want that expiration date, as I mentioned before. And you also want the tamper evident seals on the chain of custody form to be able to fit on that device, on that vial, without covering the expiration date. So those are real specific type things. Okay, so this is kind of more of the same in how HHS differs from DOT. Again, the major difference is all DOT regulated collections are required to be performed using that single device that can be subdivided into two. And you know, collectors and part of the training will also be very specific to the manufacturer's instructions. So one device may have a collection procedure that's slightly different from another manufacturer. So as a collector, you're going to have to know the differences between those devices and be trained on those. And then making sure that the expiration dates and the things are documented on the form. And I think that's that last point has already been covered. Okay, the cutoffs. So these are the major drug classes that have to be detected in the SAMHSA guidelines, and the DOT guidelines are no different. So you have your typical NIDA panel, the marijuana, cocaine, opiates, which is the codeine, morphine. I'm sorry, actually codeine, morphine is added now. Hydrocodone, hydromorphone is added as specific tests that have to be performed in addition to the 6-acetylmorphine or traditional heroin opiate marker. PCP, amphetamine, methamphetamine, and also recently added is MDMA, which is ecstasy, and MDA, another designer drug. If you know cutoffs and you know certain levels from urine screening, you'll recognize that these cutoffs are quite a bit lower than what you see with urine. That has really a lot to do with the fact that the presence of drugs in oral fluid is at a lower concentration. And so the test and a lot of things that were done over the last 20 years had to do with making sure that tests could be developed to hit these levels of sensitivity for these different drugs, because the sample itself just has lower level of drug in it than a urine sample where the body concentrates those metabolites in the urine. That doesn't really happen with oral fluid. So that's why the cutoff levels are as different as they are. I did see a question in the chat about Delta 8 and Delta 10 THC, and could those be tested for in oral fluid? The answer to that is yes, they could be tested for. They're present in oral fluid, just like the Delta 9, the parent, but they're not part of people's standard panels right now. Labs aren't adding them. These drugs are legal in many states. And so that's a big quandary right now. And I think you'll see evolution taking place in, what to do about things like Delta 8 and Delta 10, federal programs, as well as in other, just non-regulated programs, because it's becoming a real issue. And Delta 8 is present in quite a bit of samples, as I understand it, from some studies that are being done. So it's definitely becoming an issue, but it is not part of the federal program or the DOT program, and not included by most labs right now in standard workplace testing. I think I mentioned this earlier about some of the other requirements involving the DER. This has always been the case of them being available 24/7, but it's more important now that they're available and their phone numbers are clearly documented on the CCFs. And oral fluid has to be performed in all direct observed collections for the transgender and binary individuals. And there's other changes in there that are specific to MROs, SAPs, and collectors, and those can be found in the CFR Part 40. In terms of the collection procedure, there are some specific things that one has to do at the site of collection. You have to make sure that the donor doesn't have anything in their mouth. So there is a requirement for the collector or the observer to have them open their mouth and make sure there's nothing in the mouth. Inspect the oral fluid cavity. Doesn't have to be a dental exam, but you have to at least make an attempt to make sure there's nothing in the mouth that would interfere with the collection of the sample. And in cases of dry mouth, there is a requirement in there, or a allowance for the individual to be given 8 ounces of water to hydrate themselves and get that dry mouth situation resolved. And then you wait 10 minutes. Like with most of these collection procedures and oral fluid devices, there's a 10-minute wait period prior to collecting the sample. And that really helps clear anything in the mouth that could interfere with the test. but it also applies to this 8-ounce rule. If you were to give somebody water, you want to wait that 10-minute period to make sure that that oral fluid sample is refreshed in one's mouth, and you're not watering down that sample in any way. Okay, regulated employers then can begin to conduct lab-based testing after the implementation period, which is those 2 labs being certified. Speak with SureHire, your provider, to make sure you update the drug testing policies, that training of employees is set up, and you start thinking about that. Of course, you can't do it quite yet, but these are all things that you can start thinking about. What will you do when this occurs? What time frame do you need? How long would it take to train employees on the program? And then your collectors, how to make sure that you've got the qualified collectors, and you know which labs are certified, which MROs you're going to be using. That may not change at all in your program, but that's the kind of stuff you should be doing during this implementation period. Okay, and I believe, Bill, this goes back to you at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Great information. And please submit your questions. We're seeing a lot of questions in the chat section, so feel free to submit your questions. Let me take us kind of quickly through a couple of issues. One, what do the DOT regulations mean for your non-DOT program? Maybe you're not a DOT covered employer, or maybe you have non-DOT employees that you want to test as well. Or you want to do point of collection testing, which of course is not covered under the DOT regulations. The good news is you can begin conducting oral fluid testing now if you determine that this meets your needs. You'll be governed in how you do that outside of the DOT regulations by the state drug testing laws that apply to you. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are 47 states that currently allow lab-based oral fluid testing, with Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii being the 3 exceptions. And there are a lot of states most states that allow point of collection testing for either oral fluid or urine. And so you're not restricted from doing oral fluid testing in your non-regulated program because the implementation period for the DOT regulations is still ongoing. So contact SureHire, whoever your provider is, but SureHire can walk you through, like Brian said, all of the things that you need to do to prepare your non-DOT program to actually be able to use oral fluid, if that's what you want to do. And I think I went backwards accidentally. So what I want to do now is take you through a very brief explanation of how to measure your return on investment with oral fluid testing. Now on this first slide, these prices that I'm showing here on the slide do not reflect SureHire's prices or what current consulting group says you should be paying for a drug test. We could put lots of different numbers in here to get our first price of a drug test before we talk about where I think the real savings is found. For example, the price that the end user, you the employer, pay for a urine test is $15. For an oral fluid, it's $0, because we're going to combine that in the second category there, the price the end user pays for lab analysis, or a bundle price that includes collection, confirmation, and MRO, where you're seeing that the oral fluid number is a little bit higher. But let's say that we add $15 to the top line for oral fluid, and we leave it at 25 in the next category, and we add something in there for confirmation testing because we didn't bundle it into the other price, etc. And we're going to add $5 to the oral fluid MRO fee category there, and they're going to come out a little bit the same, pretty close to one another, you know, depending on how we play with the numbers. But the bottom line here is that you're paying a price for the drug test. And sometimes we make the mistake of seeing that number as what drug testing costs us. And I think what DOT wants us to look at, in case this is of value to us, is that there are other costs involved in drug testing. There are soft dollars. And so how much time does it take to send somebody to an offsite collection facility? That may be perfectly fine. We'll probably see the majority of drug tests continue to go that way. But if that's an issue for you, you may want to save that time by being able to do the drug testing on site in the workplace. One of the questions that was submitted by Julie was, when we say in-house collections, Are we talking about having a certified collector come to our workplace to do it? Or under the DOT regulations, can employees or supervisors be trained to do that? And the answer to that question is yes and yes. The DOT regulations do have provisions in there for employees, whether they're supervisors or not, to be trained to observe that collection process. As Brian mentioned, training is required for each device that you use. So there manufacturer training programs for that, or there will be. But there's the time that you save. I think a lot of employers probably utilizing the DOT regulations either for their DOT covered program or using it as sort of a blueprint for their non-DOT covered program will probably still want to use professional collectors, but they may not want to send individuals to an offsite collection facility. And so here's where the time savings and the soft dollars comes into place. It typically is going to take you about 15 minutes to conduct an oral fluid test on site versus say an hour to an hour and a half to maybe a little bit longer, depending on how remote your workplace is, to send somebody to an offsite collection facility. And so you can see it costs you money to have that individual not working, but with a reasonable suspicion test, or maybe under other circumstances, you're going to send a supervisor with that individual, and that's going to cost some time and factor into the bottom line of your cost of drug testing. So with oral fluid, it just makes it easier, it facilitates being able to do the test on site. You may end up paying for a professional collector to come in and do that for you, so that'll add to this equation here. But the soft dollars are where you really see a savings. And when you go back and you read the preamble to the SAMHSA regulations that came out in October of 2019 and to the DOT final regulations that came out in May of this year, you see they talk a lot about the cost savings of being able to do the collection of the sample on site in the workplace and send it to the laboratory from there, as opposed to sending somebody to an offsite facility. So in conclusion, as Brian has pointed out a couple of times, there are a number of factors that have to fall into place before employers can start using the DOT regulations for a DOT covered program, including the certification of at least 2 laboratories for oral fluid testing. There are other certifications out there. The College of American Pathologists, for example, there are CAP certified laboratories for oral fluid testing now. The point being, you can still use the DOT regulations as a blueprint, as sort of a best practices standard for a non-DOT oral fluid testing program. You're still going to want to get employees trained so they can do those collections on site if that's your preference, but you can start using them as a blueprint now for a non-DOT program. If you look down at the bottom, do employers have to choose between oral fluid and urine? Of course not. You can use oral fluid for, say, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, random testing, and maybe you use urine for pre-employment testing or some other combination. But in every state in the United States, there are no restrictions on using oral fluid and urine depending on your circumstances. If it allows if it allows oral fluid, because all states allow urine, but if it allows oral fluid testing, which almost all states do, then depending on the other things that are in that state law, you could potentially look at combining them to make a program that really meets your needs. And so let's now entertain some questions. I think we got to a couple of those questions already, Greta, but what else do you have for us in the time that we have left?
Sure, Bill. And thank you, Bill, and thank you, Brian, for a great presentation. For our first question, I'll actually have Brian answer that if that's okay with you, Bill. And it reads, you talked a lot about oral fluid detecting recent use of THC, but how well does it detect recent use of other important drugs that can be impairing, like meth, cocaine, and benzodiazepines?
Right, yeah, so oral fluid is really quite good at detecting those immediately after use, just like we referred to with marijuana. Within about 10 or 15 minutes, a substance like that gets into the bloodstream and ends up in the oral fluid. So they pick up those other drugs really well. And the window of detection for some of those drugs you mentioned, cocaine and methamphetamine and even benzodiazepines, is actually going to be slightly longer than marijuana. Marijuana falls into that 1 day, maybe 36-hour window. Some of those drugs are typically found in oral fluid for 2 days. And some papers I've read even a little bit longer, but it's in that 2 to 3 day window. So it's really good for those drugs as well. And I was referring to laboratory-based oral fluid testing, not necessarily instant.
Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
For our next question, I'll hand it over to Bill. The question reads, with the tighter window of detection for oral fluid, are we missing any potential positive drug test results? And if so, should I be concerned about that?
Well, let me ask Brian to help me answer that question, because there is a difference between the windows of detection for oral fluid and urine, where you've got that recent use detection capability with the shorter window for oral fluid, and sort of that gap of 6 to 7 hours at the beginning after drug usage, but a longer window of detection with urine. But Brian, how would you answer that?
Well, I would say that for most of the drugs, there should be little concern about that window of detection between urine and oral fluid. We just talked about cocaine, methamphetamine, benzodiazepines, opiates, and those things are picked up pretty similar to urine. The difference is really with marijuana. You're really detecting recent use with oral fluid, something that somebody did that morning or the night before, and so you really, and what we're seeing today is people are, maybe 5-10 years ago, people would have been more concerned about that than they are today. We see people less concerned because of hiring, and they want, they're not looking back at what somebody did on their weekend or a week ago. They need to get people on the job. So they're mostly concerned about what somebody is doing when they come into their workplace. Are they impaired? Are they on something? Or have they just smoked a joint before they came to work? So I would have answered that a little differently maybe some time ago, but now it's almost more of a benefit that window is shorter, particularly for marijuana. If you have a program, however, that is more zero tolerance and you're really looking for lifestyle and what somebody did a month ago, then you don't want to use oral fluid or urine. You really want to do hair testing. Great for that. It looks back up to even 3 months out. Certain industries do that. Casinos, some financial institutions use hair testing. So it really depends on what your program is designed for to achieve and what the goals of that program is. And having oral fluid added to the mix just gives you another option of ways to combine it with other sample types and get the most out of your program.
Yeah, and let me add to that, Greta, that I just wrote an article for one of our clients about oral fluid testing, and the title was "What Once Were Criticisms Are Now Accolades." And in the old days, just 10, 15 years ago, some of the criticisms that were leveled at oral fluid testing are now some of the things that many people in the industry are sort of praising about oral fluid testing, as Brian just pointed out. And it's just that it's just enough different from urine testing in some key areas that align very well with sort of the societal cultural trends that we're starting to see in the United States. So that's turning into a lot of positives for oral fluid testing.
Great, thank you. We're coming up to the top of the hour, so let's wrap things up for today's presentation. On behalf of the Current Consulting Group and SureHire, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. I want to thank once again Bill Current and Brian Feely for speaking on this topic and sharing their expertise. I also want to thank SureHire for sponsoring today's webinar. If you submitted a question that we didn't answer here today, we will answer you offline. We will also send you information and a follow-up email on how to access the recorded version of today's presentation. And lastly, in addition, we will also send you continuing education information for those of you that qualify to receive 1 credit for attending today's presentation in its entirety. Thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar. I hope you have a wonderful day.